A blessing is being sent to you right now, directly from the angels, wrapping around you like a warm light, touching your heart, calming your mind, and reminding you that you are deeply, completely, and unconditionally loved. Welcome, beautiful soul, to Angel's message for you. Before you scroll away, before you let the noise of the world pull you back, I need you to stay. Because what is about to be shared with you today is not something you stumbled upon by accident. Heaven guided you here, and what you are about to hear could change everything you thought you knew about the love you've been carrying inside your heart. Stay with me until the very end, because the message that is coming for you, the one that was written in the stars long before you were born, it's worth every single second. There are things happening right now, deep in the spiritual world, that if your eyes could truly see them, your heart might not know how to hold all that emotion at once. Something beautiful is moving, something sacred is being arranged, and it involves you and the soul your heart has never been able to let go of. That feeling you carry, that deep, quiet, persistent knowing, that bond that refuses to fade no matter how much time goes by, no matter how much the world tries to distract you. It is not an accident. It is not born from loneliness or wishful thinking. It has roots. It has meaning. It has a direction. And it has a reason far greater than anything the human mind can fully understand. God is behind this story. Every day, there is a name that echoes somewhere inside you. A presence that lingers even when you try to move forward. A warmth that rises in your chest when something reminds you of that connection. And no matter how distant everything may seem on the outside, that feeling does not grow cold. If anything, some days it feels even stronger than before. That is not weakness. That is not obsession. That is something divine holding something real together. Today, the angels have come to bring you a truth that very few people ever get to hear. Your soulmate is getting deeply involved, and what they are getting involved with is going to shift everything you have been feeling and everything you have been questioning. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop, because this revelation is powerful, and it is meant to bring you peace, not panic. Your soulmate is getting deeply involved with God. Every single day, this person you love is speaking with someone who has an eternal commitment, someone who listens with perfect attention, who never turns away, who never gets tired of hearing from them. That someone is God. Your soulmate is placing their life, their dreams, their fears, their love, and yes, even the feelings they carry for you, into the hands of the Heavenly Father. This is the committed relationship your soulmate is in right now. It is sacred, it is real, and it is changing everything beneath the surface. The most sacred commitment in existence, to be blessed, protected, and prepared for a love that was written in heaven, is what your soulmate has entered into. A love written with detail, with care, and with divine purpose. And now, as these words reach you, God is using this very moment to remind you of something you may have forgotten. None of this is a coincidence. The feeling you carry is not a burden to be ashamed of. It is a seed, and that seed was planted in both of your hearts by God Himself. There is nothing wrong with feeling what you feel. There is nothing broken about you for holding on. What you feel is real. And more than real, it is part of a plan. Your soulmate, perhaps without you ever knowing, prays for this love. They ask for guidance. They ask for strength. They ask for wisdom about what they feel, what is coming, and what the two of you mean to each other. They surrender in a quiet spiritual place, somewhere the world cannot see, but where everything truly begins, right at the feet of God. And that is exactly why God sent this message to you today, to remind you that you have not been forgotten, to show you that even when everything looks silent and still on the surface, heaven is still actively at work. And right now, your soulmate is being shaped, prepared, and strengthened in spirit, all so that what has already been written can be lived. This spiritual connection, the one happening right now between your soulmate and God, is stronger than any words can capture. It is a true, deep, unbreakable bond. And that is a blessing, because there is no safer place for love to be than resting in the hands of the Creator. If you were guided here today, do not doubt it. This is part of the plan. This revelation is here to ignite something in you, to light the flame of trust that perhaps has been flickering in the wind of uncertainty. God does not bring people together by accident. God builds stories with purpose. And if this feeling has persisted in your heart through all the seasons and all the storms, it is because something sacred is happening in the unseen. There are truths that, when they finally reach us, change everything. The way we feel, the way we think, and even how we see all the time that has passed. Sometimes life seems to pause. The heart holds on to a feeling that refuses to leave. And we find ourselves wondering why this connection will not dissolve, even when everything on the outside seems to have drifted apart. But what if there is something you did not yet know? Something happening every single day, moving quietly in the spiritual realm, touching you even without your awareness? This is not something visible to the naked eye. It is sacred. It is an offering your soulmate has been making, far from the eyes of the world, yet very close to the heart of God. You know that strong feeling you carry, that strange certainty you sometimes cannot even explain? The answer is above. It is in the conversations your soulmate has been having with the Creator. It is in the prayers made with a heart full of faith. In the tears no one has seen, but that God has gathered, one by one, with such gentleness. This person is seeking in God the answers the world could not give. They are placing the love they feel with trust into the hands of the one who sees all. And that is why you still feel it. That is why the bond between you remains, even as time passes, even when the paths seem to grow apart. The connection between two souls joined by purpose cannot be broken by what is temporary. And when one of those souls turns to God, something begins to move far deeper than any visible action could ever reveal. God has heard every prayer your soulmate has made, every word spoken with sincerity, every thought offered in hope. This love is being watered every single day by heaven itself. The faith of this person has been sustaining something that the eyes cannot see, but that the heart feels clearly. A spiritual connection that is growing and being strengthened right where it matters most, in the presence of God. And here is what is so beautiful about this. The secret is not hidden out of cruelty or forgotten through neglect. It is actually an expression of the purity of this love. Your soulmate understood that this feeling was too precious to be handled carelessly. That is why they sought God before seeking anyone else. And that single choice changed everything, because when you seek God first, everything that follows is led with wisdom. And you, who may have been wondering whether there is still something between you, you are beginning to understand. You are beginning to see why your heart stays steady even through the waiting. Why there is a strange, unexplainable peace even in the middle of uncertainty. It is the reflection of what is being built above. Your soulmate is being led with love, with faith, and with divine direction. And you, even without fully realizing it, have been part of this spiritual journey all along. Many times, what we call distance is actually sacred time of preparation. A season when God shapes, heals, and strengthens, not only the one we love, but ourselves as well. And all of it is part of the divine care surrounding this love. If your soulmate is walking with God, you can be certain they are on the right path. Because God never leads anyone through shortcuts. He leads through the path of truth. There are days when the heart feels heavy, when unanswered questions rise up without warning, when longing appears out of nowhere and doubt tries to take the place of faith. But now that you know about this spiritual offering, let your heart rest. You are not alone in what you feel. There is someone who stands before God every single day, asking for wisdom, asking for blessings, asking for both of you. And God, who is faithful to what is born of true love, is listening. He is caring. He is leading. Your soulmate has chosen to do what many people never find the courage to do, to place everything into the hands of the Father. And that is already great proof of maturity, of faith, and of purpose. It shows that this love is being taken seriously, that there is a real desire to live something lasting, pure, and blessed. Now more than ever, it is time to understand what is being prepared in prayer will be lived in reality. God does not waste true feelings. He transforms them into stories that glorify heaven and heal the soul. There are connections that do not reveal themselves through ordinary senses. They are bonds that happen in a different dimension, where true feelings meet faith, and where the soul is shaped by the touch of the divine. And it is in that dimension that your soulmate is connecting with heaven. Every single day, while the world spins with its urgencies and distractions, a sacred moment takes place. A moment when your soulmate closes their eyes, bows their head, or simply speaks in thought to God. It is in that moment that the bond is strengthened. It is then that prayer opens the path between the heart and the highest, creating an invisible yet profoundly real bridge. The prayer that comes from someone who truly loves carries a different weight in heaven. God does not listen in haste. He listens with full attention, with care, with presence. And everything your soulmate has placed in God's hands, whether it is doubt, longing, confusion, or love, is being received by the one who knows exactly what is to come. Nothing is lost when it is surrendered in faith. This invisible bond between your soulmate and heaven is what has sustained this love with a strength that time simply cannot erase. When everything feels uncertain, when the path seems to wind without a clear end, it is prayer that reorganizes the emotions and rekindles hope. Your soulmate has been learning, day after day, to trust God more than their own desires. And that is one of the greatest demonstrations of spiritual maturity, because trusting God is not always easy. Sometimes it is painful to wait, difficult to move forward without immediate answers. But when a person chooses to remain in faith, even without understanding everything, something begins to grow within them. And that faith transforms the way they love, the way they wait, and the way they see life entirely. With every prayer, a barrier is broken. With every surrender, a weight is lifted from the heart. With every step of faith, the path aligns more closely with what God desires. And it is through this sequence of spiritual acts that true love is being built, not on anxiety, but on trust. It is beautiful to imagine two people meeting and living a deep love. But it is even more beautiful to know that before that moment, one of them is going before God, asking for the wisdom to love in the right way. That shows this feeling is not shallow, that this connection is not fleeting, that the love that binds your hearts is being handled with reverence. And this also explains why you feel what you feel. Something spiritual is happening, even if you cannot see it. There is someone who includes you in their conversations with heaven, who asks for light over what is still hidden, who desires to live something pure, but will not walk forward without God's direction. That is surrender. That is faith. That is love that is not limited to words, but is manifested through spiritual actions that change everything. Perhaps you never imagined you were being remembered in those quiet conversations with God. But now that you know, it changes the weight of your own prayers. Because from this moment forward, you can enter this spiritual connection and care for it alongside heaven. The love of two people who pray, even on separate paths, meets in the heart of God. And that meeting is deeper than any earthly meeting. For it is there that understanding is born. Patience, respect, preparation. God does not bring people together only through earthly compatibility, but through spiritual purpose. And when one person begins to pray, heaven already begins to work. When both align in faith, what seemed impossible becomes inevitable. So allow yourself to feel peace. Your soulmate's surrender to God is not distance from you. It is closeness to what is true, to what is eternal, to what is being built on solid ground. What is born in prayer blooms with purpose. There are feelings that do not come by chance. True love is not born from coincidences. It is planted carefully by hands that know exactly what each heart needs. The love you feel for your soulmate was not planted by mistake. You are not dreaming of something without roots. God does not waste sincere feelings. If this love was born in your heart, it is because God Himself planted that seed. Nothing that begins in God is empty. It may seem as if everything is on pause right now, but God's timing never fails. And the most beautiful part is that this seed was planted in two hearts at the same time. Yes, even with different stories and separate journeys, your soulmate also carries this feeling. Because when the Creator brings two people together for a purpose, He prepares both with the same care. Perhaps you wonder why it hurts so much to feel this absence. But the truth is, when God plants something within us, the harvest time is different from the seed's time. First, He prepares the soil. He waters it with experiences. He removes what does not belong. He strengthens the roots. Only then does the love bloom in its fullness. This is not delay. This is wisdom. Your soulmate is going through the same process, being watered daily by God's touch, praying, trusting, surrendering. This person is being transformed from within because God is working where human eyes cannot reach. What is planted in faith never dies. It may go through hard seasons, through nights of uncertainty, but if God placed it in your heart, that seed is not lost. It is maturing. It is waiting for the right moment to bloom. Neither of you is being overlooked. You are both being healed from within, freed from old wounds, prepared for something new. Everything is being led with patience because what will be lived needs structure, maturity, and truth. God does not work with improvisation. He does not build stories on fragile foundations, nor does He move out of impulse. Everything that comes from Him has direction, intention, and purpose. And when it comes to true love, God acts with even greater care. Because to the Father, love is not a distraction. It is a plan. And if something deep is happening between you and your soulmate, it is because it was designed in the hands of the one who knows the paths before they even begin. There is a great difference between a passing desire and a divine plan. Desire may come with strength, but it fades with time. What is born as purpose remains, even in seasons of waiting, even in moments of doubt, even when everything seems to try to pull the focus away. What belongs to God's plan endures. And this feeling you carry is enduring for a reason. You may have tried to understand with logic everything you feel. You may have sought quick answers and even tried to move on. But what was born between you and your soulmate does not follow human formulas. There is something higher, deeper, more rooted. something placed within you both with divine intention. And God does not plant what He does not intend to care for. You know those stories that start quietly but gradually reveal themselves as part of something far greater? That is how true love works when it comes from heaven. Sometimes at first it seems like nothing more than a special connection, a beautiful feeling. But over time, God reveals that there is more than coincidence. There is a plan, promise, a construction in progress. God personally cares for the plans born of true love. He watches every action, every choice, every prayer, not to test, but to prepare. Because in order to live what is great, maturity is needed. A willing heart is needed. And that is why time sometimes seems to challenge your patience. Not because God has forgotten, but because He is strengthening what will be lived. Your soulmate is also part of this plan. This person, as you now know, has been seeking God sincerely, praying, trusting, and surrendering. And when two people are being shaped by God at the same time, even in different places, what is being built has the strength to last. It is not something superficial. It is love with a spiritual foundation. And do you know what else reveals that this comes from God? The fact that even with life's pauses, the feeling remains alive. Even if time passes, even if other paths have appeared, even if circumstances seem far from what you dreamed, still something within you keeps saying, there is still something here. This is not attachment. This is a sign that the root was planted too deeply to be pulled out by passing circumstances. Sometimes what seems confusing on the outside is being perfectly aligned on the inside. God does not need to explain everything for you to trust. He only needs you to be willing to keep watering what He Himself planted. If this love you feel leads you to pray, to reflect, to wish well, to care for yourself, and to seek God more deeply, then know that this is already the fruit of a blessed plan. True love draws the heart closer to God, transforms, it matures, it prepares both people to live something that goes beyond human promises, something that carries eternal purpose. Have you ever stopped to think about what truly brought you here today? Maybe it was a quiet nudge from your heart, an unexplainable curiosity, or that feeling that you needed to hear something real, something that would make sense of everything swirling inside you. But let me tell you with the certainty of heaven, none of this was by chance. You were brought, guided, and prepared by something much greater, by a divine force that knows your heart better than you know it yourself. Life can feel disordered at times, emotions confusing, days full of questions with no clear answers. But in the middle of this tangle of feelings, there is direction. And that direction comes from God. He led you here because He knew this revelation needed to reach your heart now. Not before, not after, but exactly at this moment. When a soul is restless, God listens. When a heart searches for meaning, God answers. And when someone carrying true love feels lost, God sends signs. This message is one of those signs. You were brought here because there is a living promise that involves you and your soulmate. God does not leave promises suspended. He confirms. He comforts. He strengthens. You are part of something being built by the Creator Himself. A plan that involves your life, your future, and the love you carry. Heaven is saying, I have not forgotten you. I have not left this love to chance. I have been caring for it all along. The connection between you and your soulmate is part of something being aligned with divine precision. What once seemed like just a feeling now reveals itself as direction. What seemed like doubt is now confirmation. You did not go searching for this answer. The answer came to you because the time to know has arrived. Your soulmate has also been guided. They have been seeking God, offering sincere prayers, and surrendering spiritually to something they cannot yet fully explain. On different paths, but moving toward the same spiritual meeting point. You are not disconnected. You are being shaped. And even if your eyes have not yet seen it, your hearts are still responding to heaven's call. This restlessness in your heart has a name, purpose. And that purpose is being revealed little by little with every confirmation, with every sign that finds you even when you are not looking for it. God does not allow a love planted by Him to go without direction. And the fact that you were guided here shows there is a divine urgency in reminding you, you are not alone. Everything you have lived has value. This feeling is real. And God's timing is not delay. It is preparation. There are distances that are not measured in steps but in processes. Sometimes you look at life and feel separated from the one you love by more than just time or space. But what needs to be revealed to you today is this: even with this feeling of distance, you are both still being shaped, guided, and molded by the hands of the same Father. While you try to understand what you feel, while you face the days with a heaviness in your chest and a longing that cannot be explained in words, God is working behind the scenes. He is tending to your heart and at the same time working in the life of your soulmate. It does not matter where each of you is at this moment. You are both in the hands of a God who knows the paths before they even take shape. This care does not happen in exactly the same way for both of you. Each has their own story, their own lessons, their own wounds, and their own responsibilities in their personal growth. But what unites you in this process is the origin. You are both being shaped by the same God who understands each person's timing, who respects the seasons and guides everything with the precision of one who never makes a mistake. God knows what you feel, and He knows what your soulmate feels as well. He sees what no one sees, hears prayers no one hears, understands emotions you yourself cannot explain. And even if you are walking separate paths right now, what is being built in the Spirit is far greater than any apparent distance. Many loves are lost because they tried to bloom before their time. But when God is shaping two hearts at the same time, He knows exactly what He is doing. Sometimes what looks like separation is actually protection. It is God preventing something precious from being offered without the preparation it deserves. True love needs emotional and spiritual structure to remain standing against the inevitable winds that will come. You may think you are in a season of waiting, but in truth, you are in a season of transformation. Your soulmate is too. Changes are happening within each of you, not changes in feeling, but in vision, in maturity, in purpose. God is working on your thoughts, your actions, your way of loving, of forgiving, of surrendering. All of this is part of the preparation so that when the right time comes, you can live this love with balance and truth. And do you know what is most powerful about all of this? Even if you are not together right now, you are still connected by the same faith. Because when two people are in God's hands, even in different places, they continue walking toward a common point, the purpose heaven has already determined. There is no time wasted in this process. Every day serves a purpose. Every emotion, every prayer, every reflection you both experience is contributing to this construction. God's timing is not passive waiting. It is a time of building. It is when He perfects what will be lived and removes from the path anything that could hinder what is to come. It is as if each of you is going through your own preparation separately, yet both with the same destination. A story born from the hands of the one who never fails. If you feel there is something invisible holding this love together, you are right. There is a divine hand over this story. And if today you cannot yet see the fruits of what is being cared for, it is because God is still watering, still pruning, still strengthening the roots. What is born with purpose needs time to become strong enough to bloom in fullness. Heaven has its own way of speaking, not always through dramatic words, but through events that touch the heart in a way nothing else can. God confirms through details that at first may seem ordinary, but carry a special message for those with spiritual sensitivity. In the days ahead, signs will be sent to confirm everything you have heard. They will not arrive with fanfare. They will come with the precision of the one who knows your innermost being, who knows exactly what will make your heart stir differently. Maybe it will be a phrase you read by chance, a song that plays at exactly the right moment, a memory that appears without warning, or a message that reaches you precisely where doubt was trying to take root. All of this will be heaven's way of showing you that you are not dreaming alone. Many people overlook God's signs because they are waiting for something spectacular. But what is divine does not always make noise. What comes from God usually comes with peace, that quiet, steady certainty, that feeling of "I needed to hear this today." And that is exactly what will happen to you in the coming days. A series of confirmations will make you understand that nothing revealed here was exaggerated. It was spiritual truth about to make itself known in your reality. God does not give revelations simply to stir feelings. He reveals to align, to strengthen, to prepare. The confirmation is on its way in simple ways but with profound effects. Just keep your heart attentive, your eyes open, and your faith aligned. It might be a dream that stays with you. It might be a new peace that floods over you while praying. Or perhaps something beyond your control will happen, but it will make you feel God is present, listening, guiding everything. These signs will not cause confusion. They will bring confirmation. And not only you will notice, your soulmate will also receive signs. God does not work in imbalance. When He builds something between two people, He tends to both sides. Keep trusting, keep believing, keep preparing, because what is in God's hands is in the very best hands. Being attentive to signs simply means keeping your heart open enough to notice when God wants to remind you, once again, that you are on the right path. That sensitivity does not come from anxiety. It comes from faith. The faith of someone who knows heaven fulfills what it promises. In the coming days, do not rush. Do not try to force anything. Simply trust. Walk with your eyes fixed on what is essential, and heaven will take care of making the signs reach you. They will come as subtle touches, but they will leave deep marks, because what is from God never goes unnoticed. And when these signs come, because you will remember this revelation. You will understand that everything you feel makes sense, that your soulmate is also being guided, that this love has not been forgotten, that the promise is alive, and that God remains faithful in every detail. God is a Father who not only listens but acts. And if there is something He firmly honors, it is what is born of true love. When God blesses a feeling, He also makes a commitment to the story that will be lived. God is committed to this love. From the very beginning, when this feeling bloomed in you with such intensity, God was already there. You did not choose to love your soulmate by accident. This bond was planted with intention, watered with purpose, and sustained by promises. And a promise made by God is never forgotten. It remains alive even when the days are confusing, even when time challenges patience. God's promise does not depend on perfection. It is not withdrawn because of human flaws. What comes from heaven is perfected even in the midst of weakness. God does not require you to understand everything now. He asks only for trust, because the love He seals with commitment is the very one He protects, guides, and fulfills. This love is being cared for by divine hands. It does not matter how many turns time has taken, nor how many doubts have arisen along the way. What God has promised remains standing. The promise is alive because it was made by a God who does not change, who saw what you felt in the beginning, who saw how your heart reacted to that connection, and who continues to see the sincere devotion still living within you. God does not plant a love only to leave it dormant. He allows something to be born within two hearts so that at the right time, it will bloom with beauty and maturity. His commitment is not only about comforting you during the wait. It is about leading you to the fulfillment of what was planned. Even if you cannot see it, there are actions taking place in the spiritual realm right now. There is surrender. There is seeking. There is transformation. God is committed to both of you because this love was entrusted to Him. That is why, even through all the adversity, something inside you remains steady. The promise is sustained by God's faithfulness, and He, as a loving Father, does not abandon what He promised to bless. When God commits to a story, He moves everything necessary to make it happen. You may have faced days of uncertainty, nights of longing, moments of questioning, but now is the time to remember who is in control. The promise you carry was not born from your will alone. It was planted by God, and everything that is His remains alive, even when it seems dormant. God knows the time, the way, and the path. And if you have come this far, if you have opened your heart to all of this, it is because you are already being prepared to see the promise fulfilled. Not with haste, but with faith. Not with anxiety, but with trust. Because when God fulfills what He has promised, He delivers more than expected. He restores what was broken. He strengthens what was fragile. He gives new meaning to what seemed lost. The promise is alive, beautiful soul, and you are about to see the signs of this truth. God is committed to this love, to you and to your soulmate, and He does not leave unfinished what He began with purpose. What He united in the Spirit, He also sustains in time. Trust. Heaven is at work. You are not here by chance. This revelation is not a pretty illusion meant to comfort you for a moment and then disappear. It is a spiritual confirmation, a reminder from above that the promise is still active. And more than that, it is being handled with the care of a Father who knows exactly what He is doing. You and your soulmate are in preparation. You are both being cared for, strengthened, and transformed. And all of this is part of the plan. Many times the waiting has made you question whether there was still something between you. On some days, you may have felt as if you were walking alone, trying to keep alive something that seemed distant. But today you have understood it was not loneliness. It was purpose. The love you feel was not stagnant. It was being shaped. Your soulmate has also been walking toward God, seeking, praying, and surrendering. And that is proof that something much greater is happening beyond what either of you can see. No distance can erase what God protects. No circumstance has the power to undo what has been sealed in prayer. The love that exists between you and your soulmate is being built on heaven's foundation. It is pure, strong, and full of purpose. And when something like this is born, God does not simply watch. He gets involved. He acts. He sustains. The one your heart beats for is being guided by the same light that brought you here today. Even on different paths, you have both been touched by the same presence. You are being aligned by the same Spirit. Both of you, step by step, are being prepared to live a love that will not be shallow, will not be confusing, will not be incomplete, but a whole, healed, conscious, and deeply blessed love. So trust. Trust like someone who already knows they are being cared for. Trust like someone who rests after a long wait because heaven has confirmed what the heart already suspected. And when confirmation comes from God, it does not fade, settles in. It changes the way you see life. You are not lost. You are being guided. And what you feel is not drifting in time. It is held in the hands of the eternal. From today forward, look at the coming days with new eyes. Be attentive to the signs. Notice how God will speak to you in simple yet direct ways. Allow yourself to feel His presence in the details. Feed your faith, because what is coming will require a willing, light, and hope-filled heart. Your soulmate is also being awakened, and the love you share is being acknowledged in heaven. The weight you have carried has not been in vain. The feelings that have accompanied you until now have not been deceptive. What you have lived within has eternal value. And if God is saying He will fulfill it, believe. Nothing can stop it. Your story has been written with love. And love that comes from God is never lost along the way. It matures. It endures. It blooms at the right time. This message does not end here. It is the beginning of a new understanding, a turning of a page within you. Keep listening to heaven. Keep strengthening yourself in prayer. Keep believing that what God promised, He will fulfill. Because the love He blesses, He also honors. And what He honors, He will not allow to be destroyed. In the coming days, be watchful. The promise will begin to show clearer signs. Your heart will feel it. You will recognize it. And when that happens, remember what has been revealed to you today. God is committed to this love, and He is about to show you what only those with faith are willing to wait to see. May heaven's blessing always be upon you, bringing peace, courage, and clarity to face whatever comes. Know that you are never alone. Strength and infinite love are being sent to you right now, so you may remain firm, confident, and radiant in your faith. May divine peace and blessing be with you today and always, with infinite love. Amen.